we go. Greetings, welcome to the Transforming Assessment webinars. This is probably the last session for 2024 on the 2nd of October today. We are looking at how to ensure robust assessment in light of generative AI developments, and we've got Liz, Kieran and Jonquil today as our presenters. So folks, would you like to begin the session, please?
Thank you very much, Matthew, and we're so pleased to be able to come and talk to you today about our research that we carried out between March and July of this year. So we'll start by introducing ourselves. I'm Liz Hardie. I was a principal investigator on this project. We're from the Open University in England. I'm a senior lecturer in law and director of our scholarship centre in our faculty, and I've got a particular interest in online technology and teaching and learning. Jonquil, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Liz. Hello, I'm Jonquil Lowe. I'm a senior lecturer in economics and personal finance at the Open University. I have a lot of interest in AI through my financial interests, and I'm also an experienced social researcher.
Thank you.
My name's...
Kieran?
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Kieran, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sorry, I was going to jump on and save the time. My name's Kieran McCartney. I'm a senior lecturer at the Open University in education, and my research interests are the use of mobile technology for assessment, and obviously that's been augmented more recently with the use of AI in assessment as well.
Thank you. So we just want to say good morning to everyone who's joining us from the UK. Good evening if you're joining us from the Southern Hemisphere. This project was carried out by a team of 12. You can see their names on the list, and it was cross-disciplinary. So we had 3 people from each of the 4 faculties in our university, covering all of the different disciplines that we teach. The research was only possible because we were funded by NCFE's Assessment Innovation Fund, so we're very grateful to them for enabling us to carry out this research. So what we're going to cover today for you is to outline the research that we did, and two things we were really focusing on was how well does generative AI perform when it's asked to answer assessment questions, and is it possible to train markers to detect generative AI in answers and what the impact of that was. So we're going to explain what our findings were and the subsequent findings and recommendations that we made. So in terms of the research questions, as I say, we were looking to see by assessment types, what was the most or least easily answered by generative AI, and also whether that varied across disciplines and levels. By levels, we mean that we chose 59 questions that covered 17 different assessment types, and you'll see in a minute the assessment types that we chose, things like essays, short answers, more authentic type assessments, and we covered 4 different levels. So that was in the UK, FHEQ 3, 4, 5 and 6. That translates to 4 is the equivalent to first year undergraduate, 5 is second year undergraduate and 6 is third year undergraduate. And we also covered some of our foundation courses, which were level 3. So we were focusing on foundation and undergraduate levels. And the questions that we chose covered 17 different disciplines. So we recruited 43 markers to mark the 59 questions, and for each question we selected a batch of scripts. So we had 10 authentic student answers which came from academic year 21-22, and that meant that we could be reasonably confident that it was prior to the widespread introduction of ChatGPT in November 2022. And for each question, we generated 6 answers by generative AI. We chose to use ChatGPT 4 because it was at that point one of the most reliably performing of the LLMs. Crucially, for the purpose of our research, we put the question and any subsequent guidance into the model. But when the answer came out, we did not edit it in any way. So it was a relatively unsophisticated method, perhaps simulating that student that just cuts and pastes from the LLM into their answer. We recognise that some students would behave in a more sophisticated way, would perhaps follow up with further prompts, would edit. But for the purpose of the research, we wanted a baseline. What happens when you simply put the question into an LLM? We did remove any reference to the answer being generated by artificial intelligence, and where the answer didn't include a reference list, we did include a reference list, but they were the only changes that we made. So the markers then received their first batch of 8 scripts, which was a mixed batch of 5 student scripts and 3 generative AI scripts. Now, importantly, the markers did not know how many generative AI scripts were in each batch. They knew there may well be some, but they didn't know how many. They allocated a mark to that script, and we asked them to indicate if they thought that it was generated by AI. We then the markers did some training, an online training that took about 2 hours, which looked at the characteristics of generative AI answers. And they then repeated the exercise with a different set of 8 scripts from the same answer. So in total, this was quite a large scale research. We had 944 answers involved in the research, of which around 350 were generative AI. We analysed the information we got using mixed methods. So we had the marking records that they'd completed contemporaneously when they were carrying out the marking. We also did focus groups with the markers, and we had training quizzes and surveys that they'd undertaken. So that was the method that we adopted. So we're going to kind of go over to you now in the chat pod. So if you click on the purple cross on the right hand bottom side and the speech bubble, you'll access the chat pod. So what do you think from your experience are the types of questions that are either most easily answered by generative AI or least easily answered by generative AI? And do you think that would vary across disciplines and levels? So please do pop in the chat pod your thoughts on what we found. That's great. Some people are starting to answer. So most easily answered essays, reports, yeah. MCQs, yeah. Knowledge recall, yeah. Yeah, anything that requires Indigenous knowledges, yeah. And these were the sorts of things that we entered this research thinking as well. Least reflective and personal experience questions, interpreting images and data, yeah. Opinion questions tend to be trickier, yeah. Fantastic. Well, I'm going to give you a spoiler now. And the spoiler alert is that virtually no question type was currently robust against generative AI. So they all, almost all, achieved passing grades, and one didn't, and others could be designed to be more robust. So before we go into the actual findings, we talk a lot in this research about robustness of assessment. What do we mean by that? So there were 2 parts to robustness in the way that we perceived it when carrying out this research. One was, ideally generative AI answers would fail our assessments, that generative AI would not be able to achieve a passing mark, and also that the generative AI answers would be able to be detected by markers. So I'm going to pass over to Jonquil now, and she's going to take you through the findings.
Thank you, Liz. Okay, so I'm going to start with how well did generative AI perform by question type. So this chart here, you can see along the horizontal axis, the different question types, the 17 question types that we tested. And you'll see lots of familiar ones there, essays, some with stimulus materials, some without, numerical calculations, analyzing data, and using scenarios or case studies. There are also some kind of less usual types that involve some form of role play or producing an alternative format, by which we mean things like a slide presentation or an infographic, or perhaps an audio tape, particularly used with, say, language modules. So there's a whole range here of different question types. Now, for each type, there were between 1 and 9 questions in the sample. And so the vertical axis is showing the average grade achieved. And the circles show the student average grades by question type, and the crosses generative AI. Now, just a word of caution. The students' samples, they were a random sample from the cohort, the 2021-22 cohort, and we didn't try to normalize that sample to the cohort as a whole. So while there is a comparison here between the sample that we drew, you can't really go as far as to compare generative AI with the cohort as a whole. That said, what you can see is that generative AI has a very similar pattern of performance to students, and in some cases, compared with the sample, generative AI even performed better than the students. That holds for all the question types except for one. There's one outlier there, activity plan, where generative AI failed all the questions. So I just take you through a little bit more about that activity plan, just to give a flavour of what generative AI was up against. So this was a second year undergraduate course in economics, and it was a role play question where students had to imagine that they were consultants for a local council, giving advice on how to evaluate a healthy food intervention. And what was distinctive was that they had to use particular tools and techniques that had been taught in the module, in particular a particular theory of change model, and then they also had to select a statistical technique from the ones that had been taught. So these were things like randomized controlled trials, difference in difference, that sort of thing. So there was a very specific link to the module materials. Also, this question had a very specific rubric, which was not just for the markers. This was also shared with students, so they knew how their work was going to be marked. And this rubric was actually uploaded as well into generative AI. So generative AI knew the rubric, but of course didn't have access to the module materials. And the third feature of this question that I'd highlight is that the markers stuck very closely to this rubric. We know in practice, sometimes markers, they like to be not too unkind to students. So there is some variation around how closely markers stick to the rubric, but this marker used it fairly tightly. So we also looked at how this broke down by level and discipline. And what I draw to your attention here is that generative AI performed really very well, very easily at level 3, which is pre-university study, so kind of the foundations of preparing for university study. And then as the levels progressed, so it's his first, second, and third year of undergraduate study, the generative AI performance lessened, became worse, if you like. So this is suggesting that generative AI does indeed, as you pointed out in the chat, perform quite well with those questions that tend to be just knowledge recall, which are often what's being used at the lower levels of study, but doesn't handle as well the type of questions that require more high-level critical thinking skills. So that's perhaps a pointer to whether we could build critical thinking into those earlier years of study on a more consistent basis. You can also see the disciplines here, but to be honest, we didn't really find anything conclusive about different disciplines. This was partly because not all disciplines had the same number of questions from the same level, and the level effect is what dominated. So we can't say too much about discipline, but we can be pretty sure about these results on level. Now I'm going to turn now to the detection of generative AI scripts and how the training affected that. But first, let me pose that question to you. Do you think, from your experience, that training would improve markers' ability to detect generative AI scripts? So if you'd like to just post in the chat. I like that, maybe. Well, that's great. Some very mixed kind of responses there. A lot of skeptics thinking that training can't help, and others thinking maybe it does. And interesting comment about being discipline specific. Certainly that's something that we found, is that markers wanted discipline specific guidance. Okay, so here's my spoiler. Training markers does improve generative AI detection, but it isn't a feasible way forward. So let's have a look at why. First, I'll just flag up though that the training we used, it was based on training that had been developed through a much smaller pilot study done by some of our STEM colleagues, and it was very much focused on what are the kind of markers of generative AI, can you spot them and can't you? The training also had various quizzes and a survey so that markers could get some feedback on how their own performance was changing as they did the training. And that training, or the core of that training, is now publicly available on the link on the slide. So if you want to have a look at it, you're very welcome and can use it in your own area. So this is just a kind of small extract, the sort of thing you'll find in the training. So sections on what might raise suspicions that generative AI has been used, and also, equally important, what doesn't help. What are you not going to spot that helps you detect generative AI, or what might mislead you? So that's the kind of thing you'll find in those training materials. So let's have a look first at what happened to the detection of the generative AI scripts and how training affected that. So the diagram on the left is the pre-training results. Now remember that each batch of marking, there were 8 scripts, 5 were student scripts and 3 were AI generated. So what these charts are showing is a detection rate, and a rate of 3 means that all of the generative AI scripts were detected, and a score of 0 means none of them were. So pre-training, you can see that perfect score was being achieved with about 50% of the questions, just under 50%. But post-training, the chart on the right, that perfect score is now achieved on nearly 80% of the questions. So that's a really good result for the training. It definitely improved the detection of generative AI scripts. And in this slide, you can see that broken down by the question types. And you can see that that improvement occurred across 10 of the 17 types, and particularly helped with numerical questions, reflection on work practice, and the scenario-based questions. There are another 4 questions where there was no change in the detection rate. In some cases, that was because we think of a ceiling effect, by which I mean that pre-training, the markers had already detected all of the generative AI scripts. There wasn't anywhere to go with the improvement. They continued to detect all of those scripts. But there were 3 questions where generative AI detection actually worsened after the training. So that's slightly worrying. But in general, across most question types, detection of AI scripts improved with training. But of course, that's only half the story. So what happened with the student scripts? So I'm going to call it detection of student scripts, but it's simply kind of recognizing that a script is a student script. Here, remember again that we've got in each batch of marking 5 student scripts. So this time that perfect score is 5. 0 means that all of these student scripts would have been incorrectly assumed to have been generative AI. So on the left, we've got pre-training, and you can see that pre-training for 80% of the questions, they were being correctly detected as student scripts, getting that perfect score of 5. Now, worryingly, post-training, that perfect score fell to around 55%. So in other words, after training, there were a lot more false positives. So what markers were telling us was that they really liked the training. They found it valuable. It increased their confidence, and it gave them a language to articulate why they considered a script to be AI generated, rather than just having that gut feeling that they had before. But they became more aware of all of those problems of that can be found in generative AI scripts, and they just started to see them everywhere, including in the student scripts. So there was this really worrying increase in false positives. And that was found across, again, 10 of the 17 scripts. When we cut it by question type, for 5 questions, there was no change. Again, with 4 of them, that was a ceiling effect. And there was only an improvement in 2 cases. So this, again, this increase in false positives was pretty widely found across all of those question types. So now I'm going to hand over to Kieran, who's going to tell you a bit more about what those kind of characteristics of generative AI.
Thank you, Jonquil. And guys, I'm going to do the next 3 slides with you before passing back over to Liz and Jonquil again. So what we thought we'd take you through here, I'm not going to read out to you on the screen what we found, but we thought we'd give you some maybe contextualized examples here. So one of the things that we noticed was that with AI generated scripts, some of the hallmarks was the use of American language and spelling. However, that can sometimes be a false positive as well, because depending on where you are in the world, for example, outside the UK, you might have your Word documents set up to use American English. So the use of Zs, for example, after the word, for example, so rather than being an S the way that we would have it in the UK, it could be a Z, but there still could be a problem with that, as I said, depending on where the student is based. One of the other things we noticed as well, now you might be interested in this one on the very top right, there's something there that says failure to use module materials. A core aspect of how we teach is that we provide students with module materials that they learn from. So the module materials are the teacher. And in the cases, some of the hallmarks for AI was that the student failed to identify how those materials had helped their learning. So they wouldn't, for example, reference them or discuss issues that were related to them within the answer itself. And for those of you who might not work in distance learning, that could be, for example, notes that you're giving to the students in class or PowerPoint presentations that should be within the assignments in some way, shape or form, but are not presented there. Moving on to the next slide. These are some of the hallmarks of AI and student scripts. You can see the AI here is indicated in red, and then the kind of false positives that Jonquil had previously discussed are in blue. So many of the hallmarks that are evident in AI are also in the student scripts. So we coded the markers' reasons for why they suspected AI into themes, and these are shown on the vertical axis. The chart records the proportion of scripts where each theme was mentioned or split correctly. So you see those in the red, and then the false positives in the blue, as I sort of said there. One of the key differences that we noticed was the tone and language, and that links back into the thing of not using the module materials. So common issues in scripts that were generated by AI is that we couldn't find that there weren't no sort of evidence of the use of the module materials was not as prominent. And some of the other hallmarks as well were common in false positives. For example, there's marked differences between the answers AI and how they manifest those answers. For example, AI wasn't always very good at drawing conclusions. And in fact, you can see one of the comments here in quotes on the right-hand side of the screen where the actual marker indicates that. And finally, and we thought you might find this very interesting, is question types that appear to be much more robust. And I'm just going to move forward to slide here. Sorry, it hasn't quite moved forward for me yet. There it is there. Now, the types of questions that are much more robust are those that we've highlighted in bold, but I want to focus on two of them, and that's the role play and the reflections. So the idea here is that role play questions require learners to apply what has been learned in a real world scenario or from module materials. And because AI can't contextualize those answers, it's not as good as to present answers that students can use in assessments. So that type of assessment is quite robust. And the other one as well is reflection on work-based practice or practice in the student's own environment, where obviously AI does not have any knowledge of experience of. So AI can't provide the answer that the student and the learner or the teacher would know to be true. So at that point, I'm going to pass over back to Liz.
Thank you very much, Kieran. So just to summarise then the kind of key findings of this research that we've shared with you, it was very clear from the focus groups with the markers, and I think we all know this, that what was being done previously to detect plagiarism, which primarily was the use of technical tools and checking to see if there was copying from the internet, that no longer obviously works in the face of generative AI. training did improve generally markers' ability to detect generative AI, and they, as Jonquil said, they welcomed the training, but it also had that worrying increase in false positives. And so we felt that detection, whether that was by training of markers or by using detection tools, we've not spoken about that in this research, but we all know that the difficulties with the detection tools. Detection, therefore, as a way forward to try and combat this may actually not be feasible, because you're going to end up implicating a lot of students that actually have genuinely answered the question themselves into that process. However, what we did find interesting was that those characteristics that Kieran went through of generative AI, yes, they're not always due to generative AI. They can actually be due usually to weaker students having poor study skills. So if we look at that inability to come to a conclusion or to be able to give a reasoned opinion, if you're looking at the art subjects, that could be because it's a generative AI answer, but it could also be because a student has weak or poor study skills. And the same applies to quite a lot of those characteristics of generative AI. So the finding really is that addressing study skills may well be a realistic alternative to detection, and I'll explain that in a little bit more detail later on. No question types are currently robust, with the one exception of that outlier that Jonquil explained. But some types are definitely less robust, and generally, as you said at the beginning, those were the more factual, descriptive, shorter answers that require the lower levels of skills thinking. Others are amenable to embedding more robust design. So by using those hallmarks of generative AI, by looking at particularly more higher level skills, it is possible to design questions that will be much more difficult to answer by generative AI. The other thing that came out very strongly, particularly through the qualitative research, through the focus groups, through the surveys, etc., was that markers were very keen to ensure students were prepared for their future and for their future employment by encouraging them to develop critical thinking skills and the ability to draw reasoned conclusions. And that also applied to AI, that we need to be developing students' critical thinking around AI literacy, you know, what it is, what is the implications of it, how to use it ethically and effectively. And that reflecting this in assessment design and marking guidance is another way forward in this space. So the recommendations that we made in our report, and we'll put a link to the report in the chat pod for anyone who wants to have a look at it, there's more detail in that, is that the hallmarks of generative AI that we started out thinking might be the way of training markers to detect scripts, actually their key value is in informing question design. So going back to my previous example, having a question that requires a reasoned conclusion makes that question much more robust against generative AI. And that needs to be carried into the marking guidance, the rubric that's given to markers and/or students. We felt that student skills intervention was probably a better initial response to concerns that somebody might have used generative AI, because whether they've used generative AI or whether they have poor study skills intervention, what the student needs is advice and guidance around their future work, rather than immediately going into generative AI kind of detection mode, looking at academic conduct investigations, etc. We're recommending that institutions, and this is an institutional response, rather than being placed upon individual educators, institutions should risk assess their question designs on each course or module. We've given an example there of an AI risk measure scale that the University of Greenwich uses to identify those answers that are most easily answered by generative AI, and to focus initially on looking at redesigning those questions and those marking guidance. And what's essential in this is using a very clear marking guidance or rubric and an explicit criteria to determine what's a fail. We then need obviously to be designing our curriculum to support that. And as I said, it's an institutional approach to this. Everybody needs to be involved in fostering responsible and ethical use of generative AI. It should not be left to individual markers or even to individual teams that design, or course teams that design the question. Looking in a little bit more detail around academic conduct and skills, one of the things that again came out through our focus groups was the importance of equipping teaching staff to use generative AI, to understand it, to be able to recognise when it might have been used, and to strengthen students' study skills. Now, different institutions have different responses to generative AI. Our own institution, module teams can opt to tell students they can't use it, but generally the default position is that they can use it appropriately in their studies. And so what we need to be doing is to be teaching staff and students what that means. As I said, we really focused on that need to support and develop skills, and recommended that the first time a student is suspected of using generative AI, a study skills intervention which unpacks whether it's inappropriate use of generative AI or whether it's poor study skills is going to be of more benefit to that student than immediately going down a more punitive route. But what came out very strongly was the need to maintain an institutional record of these interventions, so that if it happens again, it's very clear what's already been done, and if appropriate, it can then be escalated. And the other thing that came out through our research was that need to provide teaching staff with clarity about their role. So in our institution, it's not the role of individual markers to determine if plagiarism, poor academic conduct has taken place. That's done through an independent investigation. But I think sometimes the lines get a bit blurred over generative AI suspicions, and I've seen some of those comments in the chat. So institutions need to be very clear about what the role is of individuals within the course team, the markers, any academic conduct department, and provide very clear guidance around academic conduct. And of course, any decisions to refer need to be proportionate and timely. And then I've already mentioned the need for generative AI training. Of course, that's been raised, right from the beginning when this became a widespread concern back at the end of 2022. But as well as training markers, which is what this research focused on, what's become clear is there's a need for training for the staff who produce curriculum and set assessments, because the focus needs to be here on appropriate assessment design, not necessarily on detection. And we felt that by putting our time and our effort into ensuring that appropriate assessment design, that actually has efficiencies later on, hopefully, by the reduction of time that's needed to deal with academic conduct concerns. And it's also really important to train the students in this so that they understand that generative AI has its limitations and is not the answer. We all know training needs to be ongoing. I've seen that in the chat already. Generative AI, the technology is developing. Our research won't stand still, neither will our knowledge. We need to continually make sure we're up to date. And we felt that the generative AI hallmarks or characteristics can be really useful for training both staff and students. There were some discipline-specific issues that did come out of our research, that they are in the report. So again, it's important to train staff in relation to that, and also to train staff about when is it appropriate to have a skills intervention and when should it be referred further. So there can be some consistency around that, because that's fair to students if we're behaving consistently. And for students, as I said earlier, there was a real recognition of the needs to actually teach generative AI skills, both for their study so they can use it appropriately, but also for employability reasons. So we've kind of reached the end of our presentation. We've got about 20 minutes left. We will pop the report link into the chat box, but we now kind of want to open it out to people. I can see there's a lot of chat going on, but what do you think the implications of this research might be for your institution and your future assessment? Because we know that everyone is in a slightly different context. So please, over to you. Matthew, what's the best way to do this? Is it through the chat or by microphone?
We can go either way. It's probably easier for people to type into the chat. If people do want to ask a question via the microphone, if you could please use the virtual hands up symbol in the bottom center of the screen. You can see I'm doing my hands up there in the attendees list. So if you'd like to use your microphone, please use the hands up and we can let you have the say. Otherwise, the text chat is a great way to do it. I would add my 5 cents to it. Horses for courses is the implication of it. So I don't think there's going to be a one size fits all here.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and it does depend upon your own kind of context and your own institution. I have popped the link to the report for those that are interested in the chat pod. Kieran, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I actually have a question. I know we're asking for questions, but I have one for the attendees. Can I ask you all, what are you currently doing on your own assessments to take account of AI? And even if someone's to put on the mic and chat and just tell me what you're at, I'd love to hear what the rest of you are doing. And because that's another way of asking what implications is it having for all of you as well.
Hi, was it Kieran?
I think I can hear you. Is it Nikki?
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit weak, but go for it. Yeah.
Oh, can you hear me now? Is that better?
Oh, that's much better. Oh, excellent.
Fantastic. Hello, hi, I'm Nikki. I'm Head of Learning Experience Design at Torrens University, and one of the, I guess, approaches that we've been finding that's working reasonably well, and it, I guess, goes back to this reflective practice again, which has been highlighted in this research as well, but journaling and getting students to actually record the process that they went through to I mean, and this obviously isn't going to work for every single assessment, but it's actually keeping a record of how they've addressed the different phases of the assessment and critically reflecting on that. So again, it's highlighting the importance of that critical reflection. And I think that's something there is definitely an opportunity for us to bring into those earlier year subjects as well. I think that's something we can address, a lot earlier on than what we are. And, this is something that is, that ability to be able to critically reflect and critically evaluate is something that's very much needed in in professional practice as well. So I think opening up opportunities to develop that more and getting not putting a barrier between students using AI. We're very much about use it, but educating on how to use it in an ethical and appropriate way.
That's interesting, because I think what you're saying there is basically go ahead and use AI, but show us how you've done it and how it's helped you write a better assignment.
Yeah, And because it's a
Yeah.
great tool. I mean, it does help us, you know, it helps us more efficiently, it helps us come up with ideas, but how do we then expand upon those ideas, and how are those ideas supported by the research? And, you know, yeah, I think encouraging that critical reflection and always ensuring there's research to support the responses, you know, seems to be, you know, I mean, there's always ups and downs, but that seems to be an approach that's working well in some of our courses.
I may as well just share something we do at the Open University, where we actually sometimes we have a thing called module forums, and not as part of the summative assessment, the formative assessment, we would ask students to actually engage with AI, ask it a question, post the answer into a forum, and then ask other students to engage with the AI's responses. But
I
they
love
know
that.
they're engaging with an AI. So
Yeah.
now it doesn't form part of a summative assessment, but what we do is we're raising awareness regarding leadership practices in education.
Yeah, that's smart.
So yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. And I just wanted to pick up on as well something Nikki said and some comments that have been in the chat pod about moving to kind of a process approach for assessment, asking students to work out their process. And that is something that we did recommend in the report as being one of the ways that's potentially more robust. So it's great to see people, you know, our research seems to be chiming with some of the things that are coming up in the chat pod. So that's great. I think there was a question earlier on in the chat pod. I'm just trying to go back up to it, asking what is the OU doing about connecting up academic literacy and AI learning. So there is some training that's been developed centrally, which can be accessed by all our students around generative AI and generative AI literacy. And I know more is being planned. What we are trying to do is to encourage individual courses to also look at including generative AI training into their courses, because the training that's being provided centrally at the moment is voluntary. It's extracurricular, and as we're a distance learning institution, we know a lot of our students are very time poor, and so by including it within courses and module materials, they're more likely to carry out that training and to become, you know, more aware of the limitations and the kind of the ethical and responsible use of generative AI. So we started with it on a kind of voluntary process, but we are encouraging teams to try and include that within their materials, so students are more likely to do that work. Jonquil, I've not been keeping up really with the chat. I'm hoping you have. Is there any other questions that we need to pick up from the chat pod?
Yes, well, I was just answering Carol, who was asking what interventions we use at the OU, and I'm sure, like many institutions, this is a really fast evolving area of kind of policy and practice. But we do for first offenders, particularly at what we call level 1 first year, we lean towards treating any kind of plagiarism, which I would say embraces misuse of Gen AI, as a study skills problem rather than necessarily deliberate misconduct. And so the first line is skills intervention, and we do now have I mean, it used to be on an individual basis, but we do now have a kind of standardized group course that's compulsory for kind of like the first offenders to go through, and that includes how to use generative AI in an ethical way. So thank you very much, Carol, for that question. What I would also add, just going back to some of the earlier discussion that Kieran was having, is that I personally think we really have to perhaps consider again how we assess those areas where we're just trying to make sure that foundational knowledge is in place. There has been a tendency at first year undergraduate to use a lot of questions that are doing that in summative assessment, but maybe we should be considering whether that should just be formative assessment and not carry any marks. I think that does two things. You know, one is, well, there's no point using generative AI, it's not going to help you pass the module. But the other is it does convey to students that this is learning for your benefit. It's laying in the foundations that will help you do assessment later on, that is summative. But you know, we're not putting these tests here simply so that you gain marks. It's to support your learning. So I think perhaps a rethink about that split between formative and summative learning might be useful at those lower levels.
Yeah, thanks, Jonquil. And I can see there's a lot of chat about the circumstances in which generative AI could be used within assessment. Absolutely. Matthew, I think the chat seems to be kind of winding up now. So can I pass over to you to perhaps conclude?
Sure. There is some more questions popping up. Mike has put it interesting in there. Would employers prefer students good at exams or good at using Gen AI? I think that's perhaps a thing to consider. You know,
can I just jump in there, Matthew?
Yeah,
sorry.
Go ahead.
So Jonquil and I are our current project is carrying out some research precisely around that. So we are doing some, this is funded by our own institution, some research into looking at what we should be teaching students about generative AI, particularly focusing on employability skills. And so we hope to be reporting on that probably around December, Christmas time this year, because again, there's a lot of talk around what employers want and employability skills for generative AI. So we're hoping to kind of dig into that a little bit more detail. So yes, watch this space. We might have something to share later this year around that as well.
Thanks. I think that'll be quite interesting. I mean, the technology and people's learning about the technology is evolving so quickly. That applies to, you know, educators, to students, to employers, to government, to everybody really. I also come back to my earlier statement of horses for courses stuff. There's potentially, you know, some assessments where you definitely want to design the generative AI into the process because it will become a tool of the trade. But there may be other assessments where you want to, you know, assess fundamental knowledge, and, you know, looking it up on the internet is not going to really solve the problem. You know, you have to have a base level of understanding of your discipline before you can then make critical evaluations of whether generative AI is producing something useful or whether it's producing hot garbage. So yeah, I think there's very much horses for courses in the you know, in the overall program of assessment. I think the idea of programmatic assessment, as in a program of assessment, will probably become to the fore in the next few years, because we have to rethink, you know, assessments being a whole set rather than just one by one by one. So anyway, that's my 5 cents. Anybody else have questions that they might like to pose?
That's a good job. I was a comment.
Kieran, you want to get your hand up?
Oh, that's okay. Let's go ahead there. If there's a question that's more important.
I was just going to say, someone asked for the links again, so I've added the links into the chat pod, and also my email address. If anyone does have any subsequent questions, please feel free to get in touch. I'm sorry, Kieran, over to you.
No, it's okay. It was just a comment, really. You know, it's just a worldview of education. I don't know about all of you, but a lot of my friends in my networks, they sort of say that they never really applied what they learned during their degree. Not all, you know, some of it, but not all of it. And if you think about education as, you know, developing the person and not just the acquisition of knowledge, and it's going back to Mike's point about what the employers want. I think employers want people who can solve problems. And if a student demonstrates that they can solve a problem using a tool such as AI, is that the kind of thing we should be encouraging? I'm not saying that the acquisition of knowledge is not important, but the underlying skill set that students demonstrate that we don't often assess, maybe that's what we should be focusing on.
Yeah, Kieran, I think you're right in the sense, and Tim is making a comment in there, it depends on what the learning outcomes are. You know, at different levels of a program, you're going to have differing levels of sophistication, I guess, in the knowledge and the capabilities of what you expect students to do. A first year student is probably, you know, learning the basics of a new discipline, learning the fundamentals, whereas a third and final year student is probably should be able to operate as if they're a first year or first day professional in their discipline. So, and the kind of skill sets and assessments that you will use to draw out that, you know, to evaluate whether that student is at that level is going to be different at different levels, different units, different discipline areas. So there's definitely a role for the discipline-based academics in the space to help guide this stuff. My personal feeling is it'd be a bit of a mistake if an institution tries to, you know, implement a one-size-fits-all rule. You know, we know that banning it's not going to work, but there's also other models floating around as well that are a little more nuanced. And I think those are probably the direction to head, but ultimately it has to be guided by the discipline expertise of the academics at the coalface, provided they can acquire generative AI literacy themselves, which is also a trick. You know, they have to be informed to make those informed decisions, as it were. So, yeah.
Can I just mention, I put it in the chat, but I saw there was a recent paper which did something quite interesting. They just gave a prompt that said, could you polish this work? And they gave it work done by AI and work done by humans, and they looked at the changes made, and they found that they could detect the AI because the AI made very few changes to work made by AI when it tried to polish it, whereas when it was made by a human, it made a lot more changes. And they published this paper very recently, and it was the best detection of any system. It's an interesting, it was a clever approach.
If you happen to know the link, Mike, that would be great. I know it's putting you on the spot there a bit, but that would be good. I think, you know, there's a whole debate around the detection side of things. You know, do these, I mean, in general, most of the AI detectors out there seem to be garbage, but they're not all created equal either. And I think there's so many caveats around that it's a sort of a bit of a quagmire to get into. So I think ultimately we have to accept that this stuff is out there, and we need to be able to, you know, design assessments for the relevant context, the relevant learning outcomes, with the assumption that the students probably have access to these tools. You know, just as we've got access to calculators in math classes, or, you know, computers for programming software. It's going to be a tool of the trade, really. Okay, we are at the hour, folks. So if there's any hot last-minute questions, pop them in the text chat. Otherwise, we will draw to a close. I haven't decided whether we're going to do one next month or not, but otherwise we'll be back again in 2025. The recording will be on our website shortly, probably tomorrow sometime. Other than that, thank you very much for coming along, folks. We hope you have a good day, good evening where you happen to be. Mike's just popped the link to that interesting paper in there. Thanks, Mike. And the text chat and everything will also be on the recording page, so you can go back and revisit those links along with the slides, etc. So once again, thank you for Liz, Kieran and Jonquil for a great session. A lot of, you know, good food for thought there for many of us who are thinking about how do we move forward with generative AI, redesigning assessments, etc. So once again, thank you very much, and hopefully we'll see you for the next session in 2025. Thank you, Roo.